Eleanor Mae Fagan, born in Baltimore in 1925, brought with her a secret that no one could have predicted. Billie Holiday's half-sister Eleanor had such light skin that she could pass for white, and this gift would completely change her life. Adopted by a wealthy white family at age 2, Eleanor never learned her true identity and grew up as Margaret Elizabeth Whitmore. However, when she accidentally encountered Billie Holiday in the 1940s, the secret relationship that began between the two sisters would put both of their lives in danger. Because in 1940s America, crossing racial boundaries wasn't just forbidden, it was a deadly risk. If you want to discover all the shocking layers of this story, please subscribe and turn on notifications, because the family secret Billie Holiday hid will reveal one of the biggest mysteries surrounding Lady Day's death. On a cold winter night in 1925, on East Monument Street, in one of Baltimore's poorest neighborhoods, Eleanor Mae Fagan was born, destined to become her mother's greatest dilemma. Sadie Fagan was 19 at the time and was giving birth to her second child. Her first child, Eleonora, who would later become Billie Holiday, was dark-skinned and clearly showed African ancestry. But Eleanor was completely different, light enough to be considered white, with straight hair and European features. This dramatic difference wasn't coincidental. Eleanor's father was the son of the wealthy white family where Sadie had worked for a time. Charles Whitmore was a 22-year-old young man studying law at Georgetown University, and his relationship with Sadie had lasted only a few weeks. Charles never learned that Sadie had become pregnant because the young woman had decided to keep this situation secret. Because in 1920s America, a relationship between a black woman and a white man meant social suicide for both parties. When Eleanor was born, Sadie Fagan experienced great panic. The baby's skin was so light that neighbors had begun to suspect. A woman living in Baltimore's black neighborhood giving birth to an almost white baby had become a major topic of gossip. Sadie understood that Eleanor's existence endangered the safety of both herself and her older daughter Eleonora, because in black society, children who could pass for white were usually met with suspicion, and the reason behind this was questioned. The most critical decision was made when Eleanor was 6 months old. Sadie left the baby at a Catholic convent in Washington, D.C. In official records, Eleanor was listed as an abandoned child of unknown parents, thus erasing all traces of her true origins. While making this decision, Sadie felt her heart breaking, but she knew this was Eleanor's only chance for the future. If she grew up as white, her daughter would have opportunities that Sadie could never dream of. In 1927, 2-year-old Eleanor's life changed completely. William and Catherine Whitmore, a couple who had been unable to have children for 10 years, had applied to the Catholic convent in Washington, D.C. to adopt. William Whitmore was a prominent banker in Georgetown, and his family was one of America's most established families. Catherine was a respected member of New York society and was known among art collectors. When the Whitmore couple first saw Eleanor, they were captivated by the baby's beauty and intelligence. The little girl looked so sweet and docile that Catherine instantly bonded with her. The convent officials said Eleanor came from unknown European ancestry parents, and the couple had no suspicions. When the adoption proceedings were completed, Eleanor took the name Margaret Elizabeth Whitmore and moved to the luxury mansion on New York's Upper East Side. Margaret's new life was like something out of fairy tales. The best nannies, private tutors, and every luxury awaited her. William Whitmore was determined to give his daughter the best education and enrolled Margaret in private schools. The little girl showed special talent in music and began taking piano lessons. Ironically, Margaret's passion for music was the only common point with her sister Eleonora, whom she had never known. The Whitmore family loved Margaret like their own daughter and provided her with every opportunity. Margaret also loved her family very much and wasn't curious about her true origins. Because the story told to her from the convent was that her parents had died in a traffic accident at a young age, this story was sufficient for Margaret, and she didn't ask questions about her past. However, subconsciously she constantly felt something was missing, as if a part of her life was lost. While Margaret Elizabeth Whitmore grew up in luxury, her sister Eleanor Fagan was struggling to survive on the streets of Baltimore. The difference in living conditions between the two sisters was dramatic. Margaret grew up with private schools, piano lessons, and society parties, while Eleonora battled poverty, neglect, and violence. During this period, the two girls had no knowledge of each other, and this situation would continue for years. Margaret's childhood and youth were a perfect American dream. She attended the most prestigious private school, Miss Porter's School, then graduated from Vassar College with a degree in art history. She was known in society circles as the perfect young lady, beautiful, intelligent, talented, and elegant. Margaret's only difference was her passion for music. Despite receiving classical music education, she secretly loved listening to jazz music. This interest was considered somewhat strange among her friends because jazz music was viewed as lower-class music. Eleanor, on the other hand, lived a completely different life. She had started working from age 10, ran away from home at 14, and discovered her talent for music. When she took the name Billie Holiday, she began rising rapidly in the music world. However, what Lady Day never knew was that she had a sister living in the same city who shared the same passion for music. In the 1930s, while Margaret's family lived in New York, Billie Holiday had also moved to New York for her music career. The two sisters lived in the same city, but existed in completely different worlds. Margaret lived in the luxury society of the Upper East Side, while Billie lived her life in Harlem's jazz clubs. The distance between them was only a few miles, but socially it was light years. Margaret Elizabeth Whitmore's encounter with Billie Holiday occurred on an autumn night in 1943 at Café Society. Margaret was 28 at the time and had gone to this intellectual club in Greenwich Village with society friends in search of adventure. Café Society was the era's only integrated jazz club, where both black and white musicians performed. Margaret's friends viewed this club as a bold choice because racial mixing was still taboo in society circles. Billie Holiday was going to perform that night, and Margaret had never seen a jazz concert. When Lady Day took the stage, Margaret's world changed. She was mesmerized not only by Billie's voice, but also by her stage charisma. However, what was truly shocking was the physical resemblance between the two women. Margaret felt as if she were looking in a mirror while watching Billie. The same hand gestures, the same facial expressions, and even the same lines that appeared when smiling. After the concert, Margaret decided to go backstage despite her friends' objections. She wanted to meet Billie Holiday because this resemblance was too striking to be coincidental. When she entered Lady Day's dressing room, the two women faced each other, and there was a moment of great silence. Billie Holiday had also noticed the resemblance but couldn't understand what it meant. "You look very familiar," said Margaret, her voice trembling. Billie Holiday was experiencing the same feeling but couldn't yet understand the truth behind this resemblance. "I was thinking the same thing," Lady Day replied. The two women talked for a few minutes, but despite the conversation being casual, both felt this encounter was extraordinary. Margaret left her card and departed, but she couldn't sleep that night because this resemblance bothered her. After the first encounter at Café Society, Margaret Elizabeth Whitmore began researching Billie Holiday. While reading Lady Day's biography, she discovered shocking details. Billie Holiday's real name was Eleanor Mae Fagan. She was born in Baltimore, and her mother was Sadie Fagan. When Margaret learned this information, her heart began beating rapidly. Because her adoption papers stated she was Baltimore-born, Margaret decided to hire a private detective. Charles Hanson from Hanson Detective Agency was hired to investigate Margaret's past. Hanson was an experienced detective and specialized in adoption cases. Margaret told him, "Only I want to learn my true origins," but actually wanted him to investigate the connection with Billie Holiday. After 2 weeks of investigation, Hanson uncovered the shocking truth. Margaret Elizabeth Whitmore was actually Eleanor Mae Fagan and was Billie Holiday's half-sister. They were born to the same mother but different fathers. According to the documents Hanson found, Margaret's father was Charles Whitmore, a distant relative of the adopting family, and there had been a brief relationship between him and Sadie Fagan. Ironically, the family that adopted Margaret was actually her biological father's family. This discovery deeply shook Margaret. Her entire life was built on a lie, and her true identity was that of a black woman. Even more shocking was learning that she was the sister of the world-famous jazz singer Billie Holiday. Margaret spent days trying to process this truth, but her biggest fear was what would happen if this secret was revealed, because Margaret faced the risk of losing the life she had built with her white identity. 2 weeks after learning the truth, Margaret Elizabeth Whitmore decided to meet with Billie Holiday for the second time. This time it wasn't coincidental but intentional. Margaret approached Lady Day after a concert at Apollo Theater and said, "I want to talk about a private matter." Billie understood from Margaret's serious demeanor that the situation was important and invited her to a small cafe in Harlem.
At the cafe, when the two women sat face to face, Margaret's hands were trembling. When she managed to say, "Miss Holiday, I am your sister," Billie Holiday's facial expression changed. Lady Day first thought it was a joke, then was shocked, and finally fell silent when she understood Margaret's seriousness. "This is impossible. I don't have a sister," said Billie, but Margaret took out the documents that Charles Hanson had found. Among the documents were Sadie Fagan's hospital records, Eleanor Mae Fagan's birth certificate, and records of being left at the convent. The most shocking document was a letter that Sadie Fagan had written in 1927 but never sent. In this letter, Sadie wrote that she had to give Eleanor to another family for her safety, and that this was the most difficult decision. Billie was overwhelmed with tears while reading this letter because she was learning about a sister her mother had never mentioned. "Mom never told me about you," Billie whispered. Margaret replied, "I didn't know about you either. I discovered it by chance." The two women talked for hours that night and shared their life stories. While Billie learned how Margaret had grown up as white, Margaret understood the hardships her sister had experienced. At the end of this meeting, both made a decision that would mark the rest of their lives. They would keep this secret and continue to meet secretly.
From autumn 1943 onwards, Billie Holiday and Margaret Elizabeth Whitmore began having weekly secret meetings. These meetings usually took place in secluded corners of Central Park or small cafes in Greenwich Village. The two sisters were trying to make up for the years they had missed, but each meeting also carried great risk. Because in 1940s America, crossing racial boundaries, especially if someone passing as white had their black identity revealed, meant social suicide. Margaret's biggest fear was that her society circle would notice this relationship. In the elite society of the Upper East Side, if Margaret was talked about for forming suspicious friendships, her entire social position would be in danger. For this reason, the two sisters began using coded phone conversations and fake names. Margaret used the name Elizabeth when calling Billie, and Billie called Margaret May, both their real middle names. For Billie Holiday, this relationship carried a different kind of risk. Lady Day's meeting with a white friend could arouse suspicion in Black society, especially during this period when the civil rights movement was beginning to strengthen. Black artists being too close to white society could become a subject of criticism. For this reason, Billie hid her relationship with Margaret even from her closest friends. The riskiest period was when the two sisters began to grow emotionally closer. Margaret was proud of Billie's career achievements and admired Lady Day. Billie was impressed by Margaret's educated, elegant, and cultured personality. The two women saw their own missing sides in each other, and this closeness increased day by day. However, this closeness also created greater risks because they felt the need to meet more frequently. In early 1944, Margaret Elizabeth Whitmore faced an unexpected financial crisis. Her adoptive father, William Whitmore's investments had suffered major losses in the war economy, and the family fortune had significantly decreased. Margaret's luxurious lifestyle up to that point was in jeopardy. Ironically, her Black sister Billie Holiday's economic situation was much better because Lady Day's music career was at its peak. When Margaret explained the situation to Billie, Lady Day didn't hesitate. "You're my sister. Helping you is my duty," she said, and began sending monthly financial support to Margaret. This money was enough to cover Margaret's luxury apartment rent, clothes, and social life. However, this situation created a new dynamic between the two sisters. Billie was now the financial supporter of Margaret's life. This financial dependency was very uncomfortable for Margaret because she had grown up in wealth all her life and had never experienced money problems. Now she was dependent on her Black sister's help. Margaret tried to view this situation as temporary, but in reality, she knew she couldn't maintain her society life without Billie's support. This situation damaged Margaret's self-confidence and caused her to feel both gratitude and secret resentment toward her sister. For Billie Holiday, this financial support carried different meanings. Lady Day remembered the poverty she experienced in childhood and didn't want her sister to experience the same hardships. Additionally, sending money to Margaret gave Billie a sense of power because having a member of white society dependent on her meant the reversal of racial dynamics. This situation increased Lady Day's self-esteem. In 1945, Margaret Elizabeth Whitmore had become one of the brightest figures in New York society. She was known as an art collector, charity event organizer, and cultural patron. However, no one knew that she was actually the sister of a world-famous jazz singer. Margaret's society life was a perfect mask, but under this mask, She constantly lived with the fear of being discovered. The most dangerous moments were when music was discussed at society parties. Margaret's friends often talked about jazz music, and especially Billie Holiday. Comments like, "That Billie Holiday is really talented, but of course not at our level," deeply wounded Margaret. She had to listen to racist comments about her sister, but couldn't react because it could arouse suspicion. One of Margaret's biggest fears was that her society circle would notice her interest in Billie Holiday. She desperately wanted to attend Lady Day's concerts, but knew it was dangerous. The few times she secretly attended concerts, she lived in constant tension, fearing she would see acquaintances. Margaret closely followed her sister's achievements, but the fact that she couldn't share this was very painful. The most ironic situation was Margaret organizing charity events. She organized Help for Poor Black Children events for the wealthy women of the Upper East Side. She raised money at these events, but no one knew that she herself had Black roots. Margaret felt both guilt and irony while organizing these events, because she actually belonged to the community she was helping. The years 1947 to 1948 were very difficult for Billie Holiday. Lady Day's drug problems had begun, FBI pressure had increased, and her career was starting to decline. During this period, Margaret Elizabeth Whitmore was trying to support her sister, but also had to think about her own safety. Because the scandals Billie was experiencing increased the risk of Margaret's exposure as well. The most critical moment was when Billie Holiday was arrested on drug charges in 1947. This news caused a huge stir throughout America and was discussed in newspapers for days. Margaret was heartbroken listening to negative comments about Billie in society circles. When she heard words like "that woman finally got what she deserved," she wanted to defend her sister but couldn't. During this period, Margaret began sending more financial support to Billie because Lady Day's income had dropped sharply. However, this situation also began to strain Margaret's own financial condition. Her adoptive family's fortune was still in recovery, and Margaret had her own expenses. Financial tension began to occur between the two sisters. The most traumatic event was when Billie asked Margaret for emergency help. Lady Day said she needed a large amount of money for lawyer fees and asked Margaret for a loan. Margaret had to sell her own jewelry to find this money. This sacrifice showed Margaret's loyalty to Billie, but also put her in an even more difficult financial situation. When the FBI began closely monitoring Billie Holiday in 1948, it also created great danger for Margaret Elizabeth Whitmore. Federal agents were examining all of Lady Day's relationships, friends, and financial situation. The secret meetings and money transfers between Margaret and Billie carried the risk of coming under FBI radar. When FBI agent Harry Anslinger's team examined Billie's banking transactions, they noticed regular money transfers coming with the signature MEW. These transfers were small amounts but occurred regularly, and their source was unclear. When the FBI began tracking this money, the danger of reaching Margaret's accounts emerged. If this connection was discovered, both Margaret's identity and the relationship between the two sisters would be exposed. When Margaret sensed this danger, she panicked. If the FBI investigated her, adoption records could be examined and her true identity could be revealed. This situation could drag not only Margaret, but also her adoptive family into scandal, because the Whitmore family had unknowingly adopted a Black child and raised her as white. During this period, Margaret and Billie began using more complex methods to communicate. Money transfers were stopped, and meetings became less frequent. Margaret began writing letters to Billie using the code name Eleanor, and in these letters, she never mentioned family ties. The two sisters had to almost completely hide their relationship to avoid arousing FBI suspicion. In 1949, Margaret Elizabeth Whitmore began thinking about marriage under pressure from society circles. She was 24 years old, and her family expected her to find a suitable husband. However, marriage was a very complex issue for Margaret, because she could never be open with anyone about her true identity. She was terrified to think what would happen if a potential husband learned about her Black roots. Margaret's most serious relationship was with banker Henry Morrison. Henry was the son of one of Boston's established families and seemed very compatible with Margaret. However, as the relationship progressed, Margaret's anxieties also increased. Henry had begun asking questions about Margaret's past and wondered, "Why don't you ever talk about your family?" Margaret tried to deflect these questions, but as marriage became a serious option, she felt pressure to reveal the truth. The most critical moment was when Henry proposed marriage. Margaret wanted to accept this proposal because she loved Henry and needed marriage to escape society pressure. However, she was also afraid of the detailed investigations that marriage would bring. Background checks conducted during marriage could reveal her true identity.
To cope with this dilemma, Margaret sought advice from Billie Holiday. The two sisters discussed this topic during one of their secret meetings in Central Park. Billie told Margaret, "If you love him and he loves you, maybe you could try telling the truth." However, Margaret knew this was too risky, because such a revelation could immediately end the relationship in 1940s America. In 1950, while going through her adoptive father William Whitmore's private files, Margaret Elizabeth Whitmore discovered shocking documents. In William's secret safe, there was much more detailed information about Margaret's adoption process. These documents showed that the Whitmore family had suspicions about Margaret's true identity. The most surprising document was a private detective report. William Whitmore had secretly hired a detective in 1935, when Margaret was 10 years old, to investigate her past. This report stated that Margaret might be of mixed race, and black origins were possible. However, William had never shared this information with any family member, and had continued to love Margaret like his own daughter. Even more shocking was discovering that William had also gathered information about Billie Holiday. The file contained detailed information about Lady Day's career, performances, and even personal life. William had noticed the resemblance between Margaret and Billie, and had begun investigating this connection. However, he had died of a heart attack in 1951 before getting clarity. This discovery deeply shook Margaret because she couldn't understand why her adoptive father had known the truth for years, but never explained it. Among William's notes, she found a note that read, "Margaret is our daughter in any case." This note showed that William loved Margaret despite her true identity, but it also revealed how dangerous this secret was.
In 1952, Margaret Elizabeth Whitmore's biggest fear came true. A society photographer named Charles Harrison had photographed one of Margaret and Billie Holiday's secret meetings. Harrison was in financial trouble and was trying to make money by photographing scandals of elite families. Margaret and Billie's close conversation in Central Park had been a perfect opportunity for Harrison. Harrison began blackmailing Margaret by showing her the photographs. "These photos are very interesting, Mrs. Whitmore. Secret meetings with the famous jazz singer. What would your society circles think?" he said, demanding monthly money from Margaret. This blackmail was a complete nightmare for Margaret because Harrison could reveal not only her relationship with Billie, but also her true identity. To deal with this blackmail, Margaret asked for help from Billie Holiday. Lady Day was very angry about this situation because her sister being threatened was unacceptable. Through Billie's connections in the music world, they had Harrison investigated and learned that the photographer had other scandals in his past. They used this information to pressure Harrison. The most critical moment was when Harrison met face-to-face with Margaret. The photographer wanted to give the photos in exchange for money, but Margaret knew this wouldn't be the end. For this reason, she and Billie developed an alternative plan. They would expose Harrison's other scandals and silence him. This plan was risky, but for desperate Margaret, it was the only option. When Billie Holiday's health deteriorated in July 1959, it created great panic for Margaret. Elizabeth Whitmore. When Lady Day was hospitalized, Margaret wanted to visit her but knew it was too risky because there were journalists and curious people around the hospital, and Margaret being seen there could cause questions. Margaret used one of the nurses to communicate with Billie during her final days. A black nurse named Sarah Williams delivered Margaret's letters to Billie and provided information about Lady Day's condition. In these letters, Margaret expressed her love for her sister and her concern for her. However, the most important issue was whether Billie's secrets would be safe after her death. What Billie Holiday wrote in her last letter to Margaret was shocking. "Dear sister, if something happens to me, there's nothing about you among my personal belongings. I destroyed all documents. You're safe." This letter both relieved and deeply saddened Margaret because Billie was thinking about her safety even while dying. The most traumatic moment was receiving the news of Billie Holiday's death on July 17, 1959. Margaret cried alone at home that night and couldn't share this pain with anyone. When Lady Day's death news appeared in newspapers the next day, Margaret had to listen to her society friends' comments like, "Poor woman, she's finally free." Hearing these negative comments about her sister became unbearable for Margaret. Billie Holiday's funeral was held in New York on July 21, 1959, and thousands of people came to bid farewell to Lady Day. Margaret Elizabeth Whitmore was also there, but no one noticed her because she was watching from very far away. She couldn't approach her sister, couldn't cry at her grave, and had to make even her final farewell in secret. At the funeral ceremony, Margaret observed Billie's friends from the music world, her fans, and her family. Sadie Fagan was the mother of both daughters, but was unaware of Margaret's existence. Margaret desperately wanted to approach her mother and introduce herself, but she knew it was impossible. This situation was one of the most painful moments of her life. After the funeral, Margaret secretly visited Billie's grave. She left gardenia flowers on the headstone, Billie's favorite, and had her final conversation with her sister. "I'll never forget you, sister. This secret will be buried with me," she whispered. This visit was the final point of the 16-year secret relationship between the two sisters. Most ironically, Margaret's name was never mentioned in the funeral news. She wasn't on the list of Billie Holiday's close friends, because no one knew they were sisters. Margaret had to continue being invisible despite her sister's death. After Billie Holiday's death, Margaret Elizabeth Whitmore began being even more careful to protect the secret. If any documents related to Margaret emerged during searches among Lady Day's personal belongings, it would be a huge scandal. Fortunately, Billie had kept her word and had destroyed all documents beforehand. Margaret's biggest fear was that Billie's biographers would discover this secret. When books about Lady Day began being written in the 1960s, Margaret anxiously followed every publication. However, no writer could discover the connection between them because there was no trace of such a relationship in official records. In the 1960s, Margaret married and took the name Margaret Morrison. She never revealed her true identity to her husband Henry Morrison and continued carrying this secret throughout their marriage. They had 2 children, and Margaret never told them the truth either. Her children never knew about their mother's connection to Billie Holiday. The most painful moments were when her children listened to Billie Holiday. When they said, "Mom, this Lady Day sings very sad songs," Margaret's heart would break, but she would hide her emotions by saying yes, she was a very talented woman. When her sister's music played at home, Margaret usually left the room because it was emotionally too difficult for her. In the 1970s, with the influence of the civil rights movement, interest in Billie Holiday increased again. Lady Day's song "Strange Fruit" became one of the symbols of the racial struggle, and documentary films began being made. Margaret Elizabeth Morrison watched these developments with anxiety because increased interest raised the risk of revealing hidden secrets. The most dangerous moment was the 1972 film Lady Sings the Blues. During research for the film, there was a possibility that Margaret's name could come up because Billie's financial situation was being examined in detail. Margaret lived very tensely during this period and didn't even dare to watch the film's screening. When the film achieved great success, Margaret both felt proud and worried. When Margaret's mother Catherine Whitmore died in 1975, the last connection to her adoptive family was also severed. In Catherine's will, after saying "with the love of my real daughter" to Margaret, there was a special note. "Whatever Margaret's past may be, she is our family." No one understood whether this note contained hints about Margaret's identity. During this period, Margaret began making secret donations to preserve her sister's memory. She was anonymously sending money to the Billie Holiday Foundation and supporting jazz music scholarships. This was the only way she could show her love for her sister, but no one knew these donations came from Margaret. In 1985, when Margaret Elizabeth Morrison turned 60, she began reviewing her life. The weight of the secret she had carried for 40 years had worn her down, and occasionally she felt the desire to reveal the truth. Especially after her grandchildren were born, she wanted to tell them who their famous aunt was, but she knew this was too dangerous. Margaret's biggest regret was not being able to spend more time with Billie Holiday. During their 16-year secret relationship, they had always lived in fear and couldn't fully experience true sisterly feelings. Margaret couldn't openly attend Billie's concerts, couldn't celebrate her achievements, and couldn't be by her side during hardships. When Margaret's health deteriorated in 1990, she was determined to take this secret to the grave. She had never told even her husband Henry the truth, and had given no hints to her children. Margaret thought this secret could endanger future generations as well, because racial issues in the U.S. continued to remain sensitive. Finally, when Margaret Elizabeth Morrison died in 1992, she took with her the secret that she was Billie Holiday's lost sister. At her funeral, no one knew her true identity, and her headstone simply read "Beloved Wife and Mother." Margaret's connection to Billie Holiday became one of history's lost secrets. After Margaret Elizabeth Morrison's death, mysterious documents were discovered among personal belongings found in her house's attic. Her children found their mother's collection related to Billie Holiday while examining these documents: concert tickets, newspaper clippings, and even a few letters.
However, they couldn't understand the meaning of these documents because Margaret had left no explanation. The most mysterious item was a signed photograph of Billie Holiday. On the back of the photo was written, "To my dearest sister Margaret, with love forever, Eleanor." Margaret's children couldn't understand what this signature meant because they didn't know anyone named Eleanor. This photograph was the final evidence of the secret bond between the two sisters. Today, music historians still don't know the source of the regular money transfers signed MEW in Billie Holiday's financial records. These transfers occurred during critical periods of Lady Day's career and helped her survive. However, the identity of the person who sent this money was never revealed. Margaret Elizabeth Morrison's grandchildren still wonder about their grandmother's interest in Billie Holiday music. According to family legend, Margaret would always cry when she heard Lady Day's songs, but never explained why. This emotional reaction continues to be a topic of discussion within the family. Perhaps the greatest tragedy is that the two sisters never got to truly know each other. Billie Holiday and Margaret Elizabeth Whitmore maintained a secret relationship for 16 years, but could never freely experience true sisterly feelings. In 1940s America, racial boundaries proved stronger than blood ties and separated the two sisters forever.